In this video, you're going to be refactoring and testing EditExpensePage, much like we did with AdExpensePage in the last one. Now, there is one quick tweak I meant to make. So in the last video, I set up the name for this to onSubmit, and that's not ideal. What I meant to do was set it equal to the name of the action generator, which would have been AdExpense. So I do want to go ahead and change that to give you the right information. So right here, it would be AdExpense. Up above, we would call this .props.AdExpense. Now that's also going to require us to make a few small tweaks to our test cases. This test case can stay exactly the same, but this needs to change. So we are now going to be passing in AdExpense, and I'm going to call this one AdExpense in all of those locations. Last up, down below, we are going to accessExpenseForm.prop.onSubmit. That is still correct. There is no need to change that. We do just need to change this guy right here. So with this in place, we can save both of the files and the test should rerun and everything should still be passing. So the only reason we did that was just to change the name from onSubmit over to the actual action generator name. And that brings us to what you're going to do in this video, which is to refactor EditExpensePage and then add the test file with a few test cases. We can pull up the EditExpensePage component right here, and I am going to add some comments to outline exactly what I'd like you to do. Right here, the first thing you're going to do is refactor EditExpensePage to be a class-based component. So much like we did before, you're going to go ahead and refactor this to be a class-based component that is going to allow us to pull out the inline functions to methods so we don't have to redefine them every single time the component gets rendered. You're also going to set up map dispatch to props. In this particular case, you're going to be setting up two things where previously we just set up one. Now, the reason we're doing that is because we have two things. We have edit expense and we have remove expense. So you're going to be creating two things on that object you return: edit expense and remove expense. Now, once again, you're just going to pass the data through. So just like we did over here, we get the data in and we pass it through, allowing us to abstract away the reference to this global, making it easier to use spies in our tests. So once you have both of those in place, you can go ahead and just start up the app in development mode and make sure the component still works. Then part two is going to be to actually write the test cases. So let's go ahead and talk about that down below. There are going to be 3 test cases total. First up, should render the edit expense page. That's an easy one. You're just going to use a snapshot to test that. And I'll leave a note, snapshot. Then we're going to have 2 others. First up will be something like should handle edit expense. And this one is going to require you to use these spies. So we're going to be passing in those spies. We're going to be triggering things and making sure that the spies actually got called. Then the last one would be should handle remove expense. Here you're going to do the exact same thing up above. So we're going to be using spies once again. The first test is similar to the first test over here, and the other 2 tests are similar to this last guy. And you can also choose to use before each. So you just have to set up the component with the spies a single time, and you can use them throughout all 3 files. Now, if you get stuck on any of these steps, you can always refer to the last video where we essentially did the same thing for a different component. And I would like you to go ahead and try to get all of this up and running. If you do get stuck and you just can't get it working, that's okay. I know this challenge is a little more than I usually give you, but the whole point is to give you more and more real-world hands-on experience. So you might stumble a little more and you might think that maybe you're regressing and you're not learning as much. That's not true. I'm just giving you harder and harder challenges to really push you to the next level. So take some time to knock this one out. Take as much time as you need. Change the component. Add those 3 test cases. Get everything working. Then you can go ahead and watch me do it. So pause the video, and when you're done, click play. How'd that one go? I know that was a big one, but hopefully you were able to get either partway through or hopefully all the way to the end. Now I'm going to go ahead and kick things off starting at the top by refactoring the edit expense page component to be a class-based component, pulling out those inline methods right here. I'm going to export the class edit expense page, which will extend React.component. Then I'm going to go ahead and set things up. We're going to have 2 methods, one for each of these guys, and a third one obviously for render. So I'll start off with the ones for onSubmit and onRemove. You might have called yours something different. That's perfectly fine. OnSubmit is going to equal, and it's going to equal this function right here. So I'm actually just going to take it, cut it out and paste it up above. Now we do need to make a few changes to it. For example, we are accessing props, which doesn't exist. In a class-based component, we have this dot props. I'm going to type it once and copy it to put it everywhere else. Right here, this dot props dot history and this dot props dot expense dot ID. Awesome. So this one is all done, and we can move on to the next guy, which I'm going to call onRemove. OnRemove, once again, will equal an arrow function. We already have that arrow function defined down below, so I can just take it, cut it out, and paste it up above. Once again, tossing this dot in front of props right here for history, and over here for the ID as well. Last up, we just have to define render. Render is going to be a class method. And once we do have render in place, we're going to go ahead and just return the JSX, whatever happens to be left. In this case, it's a pretty simple setup. So I'm going to take return as well as those parentheses, cut it all out, and paste it all up above. All we really need to do from here is correctly pass in those methods. So right here for the expense form on submit, we want to reference this dot on submit. And for remove, we want to reference this dot on remove. And right here, we're going to toss this dot in front of the props.expense usage. Now we are actually all done, and we can go ahead and remove down below the edit expense page stateless functional component, which is now nothing more than just a shell of what it used to be. So that is step one, refactoring the edit expense page component to be a class-based component. Step two for us is going to be to set up map dispatch to props. That's going to happen down below. Right here, I'm going to create a const map dispatch to props, and we know that this is just going to return an object, and we know that it gets called with dispatch. So I'll set up dispatch, and then my arrow, and finally I will implicitly return an object. Now we can use this exact same approach up above. We have an arrow function that returns an object. We can just take the object, cut it out, remove the curly braces, toss in some parentheses for implicitly returning an object, and paste the object in. You did not need to make this change to map state to props. I just do want to make you aware that you can apply the same pattern in both situations. Now down below, we can actually get to the meat of why we're here, which is to set up those two things. First up, edit expense. Edit expense needs to get set equal to a function, and this function is going to dispatch something. What is it going to dispatch? It's going to dispatch whatever comes back from the edit expense action generator. Now, does data need to flow between these? Yes, we can see that up above. We have an ID and we have the expense, so we're going to define those here, ID, comma, expense, and here, ID, comma, expense. Now we can actually change the usage up above. So right here, we can get rid of the dispatch keyword, the opening parenthesis, and the closing parenthesis. Now we are successfully calling the new prop edit expense, which we just defined. We're going to do one more for remove expense. Now remove expense also required the prop, and I didn't really tell you how to do this. I was kind of hoping you would refer to the documentation to take a peek at how this can get done. If you did go over to the documentation for this particular thing, in this case it would be the React Redux documentation, you would have seen that the props for that component, they get passed in as the second argument, which is what we saw for map state to props. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up, props. Then I'm going to define the thing right here. That would be remove expense. And from here, we're just going to set it equal to a function. The function is going to dispatch something. We're going to dispatch whatever comes back from calling remove expense. Now, do we need to pass some data in between these two? Yes. Up above, you can see we have an object that has the ID on it. So I'm just going to take the data that comes in and pass it down. Now, all we need to do is change this right here. We're going to remove dispatch, the opening parenthesis, and the closing parenthesis, and there we go. We now have steps 1 and 2 all done, aside from referencing right here as the second argument to connect map dispatch to props. I'm going to go ahead and save the edit expense page component, and now we're going to start focusing on the test cases. So we have test cases, one that uses a snapshot and 2 that use spies. We also have to actually create that test file. Step 1, let's go ahead and create that test file down below in the components folder. That is going to be edit expense page.test.js. And once we do have that created, I'm just going to take the comments related to the test cases, cut them out of this file and paste them over here so we can continue to use them without having to switch files. I'm also going to remove the challenge comments for the 2 steps which we already completed. So what are we going to do over here? Well, we're going to start by importing the things we need in order to actually write these test cases. First up, we're going to go ahead and import React from React. Then we are going to import shallow, and that's going to come from Enzyme. Then we're also going to grab our fixtures data, import expenses from, going up a folder into the fixtures folder. In there we have the expenses file. And last up, we just need to grab the thing we're trying to test, which is the named export edit expense page right here. Importing the named export edit expense page, and we're grabbing that from the file. So we have to go up 2 folders, which is the source folder, into the components directory, and inside of components we have the file edit expense page. Now it's time to actually create some of these test cases. And once again, just like with add expense page, we have some things we have to provide to the component. We're going to be providing them over and over again. So what I'm going to do is use a similar pattern. Before I write a test case, I'm going to set up some variables. I'm going to use before each to initialize those variables. Then and only then will we actually write the first test case. For this one, we need a few. We need edit expense page, remove expense page, and we also need history. So we're going to have one more than we had up here. Let's go ahead and knock that out. Let edit expense page, edit expense, remove expense, history, and finally, we are also going to have wrapper. So we have those 4 variables, and now we're going to use before each to define them. We're going to initialize the first 3 using spies, and the last one is just going to be the rendered component. So let's go ahead and kick this off. Edit expense is going to be a spy. That is going to be jest.fn. Next up would be remove expense. That is also going to be a spy, jest.fn. Lastly, we have history. History is actually an object on there. We have push. Push is what's going to be the spy for us, jest.fn. Awesome. So those 3 are all set up, and now we can just take some time to render the component. So I'm going to set a value for wrapper. I'm going to set it equal to a call to shallow. And we are going to render edit expense page. Now we can pass all of those props in as well. You can do this on 1 line or multiple lines. It really is up to you. Right here, edit expense needs to come from the edit expense spy defined up above. Next up, what do we have? We have remove expense. Remove expense needs to come from the remove expense spy defined up above. And this is getting a little long, so I will break it out. Adding all of the props onto their own lines. Perfect. And the next one that we're going to provide to edit expense page sitting right here is going to be history. History is going to come from, in this particular case, well, it is going to come from history. Awesome. Now, this is the edit expense page component, so we're also going to pass an actual expense down, and that needed to happen via the expense property. So we use this .props.expense in a few different places. We're going to make sure that does exist by setting expense equal to one of our fixture expenses. So I can access the expenses array. I'm going to go ahead and grab the last item, the guy with the index of 2. So at this point, we have before each all set up. We have all of our spies ready to go. We have our component rendered. And now we're just going to go ahead and actually add the test cases down below. Starting with the snapshot one, I am going to test right here. I can take this and just copy it 3 times for the 3 test cases, and we'll start off with this one. Should render edit expense page. I'm going to toss that right there, and all we need to do is add expect. I'm going to expect something about the wrapper that we just initialized. I'm going to expect it to match a snapshot. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, we can actually go ahead and save our test suite. I can crack open the terminal and we can see exactly what happens. We do have one new snapshot in place. All of our test cases are passing. And before I go on, I am just going to take a look at the snapshot file for edit expense page. Right here, we have our one snapshot and everything looks good. We have all of the data correctly getting passed down into expense form. Now that we have this in place, we can focus on the other 2 test cases where we actually have to use our spies. For the first one, we will use this guy, should handle edit expense. I'm going to paste that in. And for the second one, it will be should handle remove expense. So I'll copy that and paste it up above. Now I can remove the challenge comments and we can just focus on knocking out these two test cases. So for this one, I want to make sure edit expense gets called. That happens right here. So what I need to do is trigger on submit on the expense form. That should run this, and then we can just use a spy to make sure the correct data was passed into push and edit expense. So let's kick things off by actually finding expense form and calling it. I am going to use wrapper.find to find expense form. Once I have expense form, what am I going to do? I'm going to access one of the props on there using prop. I'm accessing on submit. Then I'm going to go ahead and call what comes back. And I need to call it with the exact same stuff we expected it to get called with in the real world, which is just an expense. So I can go ahead and pass an expense down. I'm going to get that done by using the exact same expense. So expenses. I'm going to grab the last one with the index of 2. And now that we have this in place, we can start making some assertions about what should have happened to those spies. The first one I'm going to make is an assertion about the history.push spy. So right here, I can expect, and I'm going to expect that history.push. Here we are going to use to have been last called with, and in that case, it will just be /. From here, we can go ahead and save the test suite and make sure our tests are passing so far. Everything is good. So let's go ahead and make an assertion about what the edit expense spy got called with. That is going to be expect. Right here, we have that edit expense. Then we are going to use the exact same assertion. That is the to have been last called with one. And we're going to expect it to have been last called with. In this case, it's 2 arguments. The first one is the expense ID, and the other one is the expense object itself. So right here, I'm going to access the expense ID, that is expenses, grabbing the last one with the index of 2, accessing its ID, and then the second argument is just expenses, the index of 2, not grabbing any particular property, but just the entire thing. Now we can go ahead and save the edit expense page test suite again, rerun the test cases, and everything is still passing. So the last one we have is the should handle remove expense one. This one is very similar to what we just did. We just have a different thing getting called. We have the remove expense spy getting called. So up above, I can go ahead and just duplicate this and tweak it to fit our needs. Now, what am I trying to call? I'm not trying to call on submit at all. In this case, I'm actually trying to click a button. So we're going to go ahead and get that done. That would be wrapper. Right here, we are then going to go ahead and use find to find the button. And once we find the button, we are going to simulate something. We are going to simulate a click event. Now in this particular case, we don't even name the argument, so there is no need to define anything as that second argument. It is enough to just use simulate click. Now we can go ahead and expect that push got called with /, which should be the case. We should still redirect. And the last thing we have to do is make sure the object that got passed to remove expense was correct as well. So right here, I'm going to expect something about remove expense, which is the spy defined above. I'm going to expect it to have been last called with an object, and on that object there should have been an ID, and that ID should have been the last item's ID. So expenses, grabbing the last one, and grabbing its ID. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and save the test suite. Once again, it should run through all the test cases, and here we have it. We have 48 passing test cases, including the 3 new ones that we just set up for edit expense page. So I know that was by far the biggest challenge we've had so far, and there were a few tricky spots in there. The goal wasn't necessarily to get every single student to 100%. The goal was to give you some space to play around and actually try to use all of the stuff you learned in the real world. Now that we have this in place, there is just a single component left to test, then we will be done this section. I'm very excited to get to that. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. I'll see you in the next one.